Green Fruit, Chapter 11. Deanna went from being politically helpless, a situation that was pretty much normal for her, to being offered some power and feeling personally and professionally quietly horrified. Once again, she was being offered the wrong sort of power. That seemed to be all she was ever offered. She was smart enough to know that taking power was the surest way of obtaining and retaining it, but she had refused to do that. She had rejected the irony of self-fulfilling prophecy, of being labeled a monster and therefore becoming one. She had instead set about trying to earn respect, only to discover the system of obtaining respect required some sense of likeness with others, which she lacked. The Alliance had rescued her from a Batarian Black Ops lab as a child, and therefore she had identified them as the good guys. As the sense of good peeled off in crazing patches, the flat-out evil of Reapers had arisen along the way, and although she knew the Alliance was limited by being, ironically, only human in ways she wasn't, there were still guys, even if they weren't particularly good. In the big picture, regardless of whether or not she was a monster, relatively, Reapers were monsters, absolutely, and she could hold on to that without doubt or equivocation. Exposure to Karin Chakwas was like being pulled out of the freezer and left to thaw on a countertop with the inevitable sense of being roasted for someone's dinner. Her options, as she heard the knives sharpening and felt that the warmth she was experiencing could be the oven heating up, were to preemptively report on Shepard to someone who did have power, or side with Shepard and aid him in whatever he was after. Her passive assistance in the lab wouldn't last, she knew. She had to pick a side, and she was too stubborn to side with only herself or to be that monster. So she waited. Right now she was going through the painful and helpless sense of warmth spreading through her despite her wanting to stay cold. She was feeling more vulnerable than she had since she'd been an idealistic and dream-prone child of pure potential, composed of unique destiny and gifts, imagining being an Alliance hero. Here were true Alliance heroes. One of them under arrest for murdering Batarians, which was frankly bullshit. Shepard had made a tough call at high risk, resulting in the loss of Batarian lives, but otherwise saving all the other lives that would have been overrun by Reapers. So Deanna was now experiencing a resurgence of vulnerability she'd managed to avoid since the first few episodes of hard reality had struck after entering service. She considered she'd been tempered and hardened, and now she was melting. She wondered if being frozen had done enough cellular damage metaphorically that what was left was soggy mush that couldn't hold any shape. She hadn't been given any directives about the front desk except to sit there, weird enough on its own. No military hardware, no orders to shoot or even restrain Commander Shepard. No weapons allowed. Now she was in the lab working on Keprals, something that did qualify as heroic. Nobody had reissued a regulation wig. Nobody had asked her to spy on Shepard or Chakwas. All suspicious. That likely meant that Shepard and Chakwas were already sufficiently monitored, and that the Alliance was waiting, just as they had after Saren, until they knew releasing Commander Shepard was no longer a political liability. Meaning everyone knew that Reapers were what would get him out of this high-class jail. Including Shepard. That's likely why he agreed to it in the first place. Except that it was still extraordinarily dangerous. Considering her luck and Shepard's luck, she did not want to be on the wrong side of that. But she was. Close association with Thane Krios and Karin Chakwas assured Deanna that, according to them, extraordinarily dangerous with access to a decent takeout menu, was overall a good, if precarious, deal for the current inhabitants. Except there was David. And a baby. Deanna was terrified that this setup made Karin, Chakwas, and Commander Shepard's children easy targets. She supposed easy was relative. They'd spent their lives on a pirate ship. David had been a horrific experiment, and Karin had been abducted by collectors, and Shepard had rescued them both, and... yeah. Deanna was out of her depth here. She put her head down and stuck to the science, thawed out, and tried to keep her spine from collapsing under the weight of warm, wary, and weird. Then came Skillion 5. Ironically, exactly where she wanted to be and exactly what she wanted to avoid. She barely remembered how she got there, mostly having mumbled, "Yes, ma'am," to Karin Chakwas for weeks. She mumbled her last assent for the day and then realized what she'd agreed to. Deliver certain results to Karin out in the living space Deanna avoided. Head down, she tried to hand the printout to Dr. Chakwas unobtrusively, who was sitting at a huge round table with Commander Shepard, David, and Thane Krios, all playing cards. She gritted her teeth, assuming this was her next reluctant audition, as she could have delivered this data directly to Dr. Chakwas's Omnitool. She was not at all shocked when Karin's hand closed gently on her wrist. "Miss Karin, please join us." "I'm sure I could not, ma'am." The metaphoric elephant in the room rose from his seat and reached out a hand to her. Commander Shepard said, "Please, I insist. If I'm gonna be mutilated at cards, I need more witnesses." He was tall and handsome, and she eyed his hand like a snake. Most people avoided touching her. For good reason. She was part Asari, and the fear that she was partially psychic wasn't untrue. She couldn't, in fact, read minds that easily, but she did get impressions quickly. Touching Karin Chakwas had induced the warm sense of defrosting calm. Thane Krios touching her had induced a sense of fear that made her spine want to curl up into something resembling a combination of fetal position and hypothermia. So she'd go all out and be offensive. Most people choose not to shake hands with me. He shrugged. "Are you gonna steal my soul?" "Too late. Karin has it." Dr. Chakwas laughed. Deanna smiled despite herself and extended her hand. She didn't feel fear, and she didn't feel warmth. She felt something solidly gray, like his eyes. Solid and veiled. Above all, solid. What that thing was, she could not tell before his hand was withdrawn. He indicated a sideboard and started gathering up cards, dealing her in. "Grab some food. These guys won't let me arm wrestle, so I'm stuck with cards. You know how to play Skillion 5? A quick huff of breath out, and she was dazedly getting a plate, thinking that Commander Shepard was very tall and very gray and very... She expected Thane Krios to have discovered her favorite food and gift-wrapped it, but instead there were a few pizzas. And although she liked pizza, at least she didn't feel obviously targeted. Which she should. Very. Was being subtly targeted worse than being overtly targeted? Yes! Well, she wasn't dead yet. She sat stiffly and said, "Yes, sir." Then listened as Commander Shepard declared, "Standard rules. David's wild." She had no idea what that meant. She couldn't taste anything as she chewed. She wasn't particularly interested in group games, finding that if she was good at them, she was resented, and otherwise she despised dumbing herself down. Playing cards with a Drell, who had a perfect memory, also seemed self-defeating. Seemed the best she could do would be to lose quickly and leave. To her cramped and solitary, cold room, where she could attempt to refreeze. Good luck with that. She avoided looking around the warm, beautiful space with a warm, beautiful woman, Nebula Gray, and slick green death. But she'd seen enough. David being wild became slowly apparent. David stood after the cards were dealt and walked behind each player one by one in a timed consideration. He stood behind Thane and nodded, did nothing. Stood behind Shepard, nodded, and took one card out of Shepard's hand. Stood behind Dr. Chakwas and took 2 cards out of her hand. Deanna sat weirdly amused as David took 3 cards out of her hand and then sat back down, displaying them in front of him proudly with a beatific smile. Shepard redealt to replace those cards to each member, and then it began again, David taking what he wanted out of anybody's hand. Sometimes he built the cards into a displayed prime number or a straight or a flush. Sometimes a pattern she did not recognize, but she was certain existed. As though day after day in the lab with David weren't enough to make Deanna want to protect him, now she was listening to gray-green medical badassery talk calmly as their hands were raided. I am so screwed. And then she realized why no favorite foods and no need to be coerced. David was the best canary in the mine that could exist, really. You can't force an autistic kid to be this comfortable, this proud, and this joyous. He's just this way because his parents love him, and that's enough, isn't it? She could see it or not. Which side to pick between herself, the Alliance, or Shepard really depended on how well she could read them, not how well they could read her. And Karin Chakwas won a lot. Shepard complained. David leaves you with the good cards. David leaves me with cards. I play them. Shepard turned to Thane. Come on, Drell. You can't just come here and get all healed. You've got to help me take this woman down. I have tried. The power of her bluff is a difficult thing to overcome. True. I suppose you have a disadvantage. We all know you're probably lying. We kinda expect her to tell the truth. And she has excellent distraction capability. Yeah, she does. Deanna didn't say anything, but was curious, lifting her head. Shepard rolled his eyes at her. She tells medical horror stories. Deanna's other brow rose higher. Dr. Chakwas shrugged. I tell stories. Shepard rolled his eyes more. She freaks me out. I have spent a life contemplating and causing death, but... Shepard gestured at Thane. Right? She makes me feel things about it. Mostly grossed out. And terrified. Dr. Chakwas made her bid for the round. I believe it should be mandatory to be educated on such things. I'm educated. Stop already. But we have not discussed placental abruption. Shepard dropped his cards and covered his eyes. No, you will not. I don't know about the second part, but I recognize the word placenta. Just no. We have always faced the risk of the placenta, in essence, peeling away from the uterine wall. which simultaneously makes the mother bleed out internally and deprives the fetus of oxygen and blood, most often historically resulting in the deaths of both mother and child before anything could be done. Shepard turned physically gray in skin tone. "Oh my God! It can do that?" Dr. Chakwas allowed David to take 2 more cards from her hand, and Deata held out her own as David moved to her, and she couldn't keep her lips from twitching. "Yes, it affects 1 out of 150 pregnancies, and mortality rates are high comparatively, even now. It is difficult to detect or deter." Shepard shut his eyes tight. "Look, I signed up to have children. I did not sign up for this." "Then we are all grateful that Karin is the brave woman attempting it." Shepard folded, stood, and crouched down near Dr. Chakwas's belly. "Listen, I've never spoken to a placenta, but I mean this. None of that crap. Just none of it. Not okay." Dr. Chakwas started to laugh and then placed her hand on her stomach. "Cherie, placentas rarely respond to pep talks." Shepard leaned in closer and put his hands on either side of Dr. Chakwas's stomach, as though he were covering the baby's ears. "Don't listen to her, Grace. You tell that placenta what's what." Oh, their baby was a girl. And her name was Grace, and... Oh. David began building a structure with the cards and no longer returned them, so playing even limited hands became impossible with David being wild. Deata did not lose quickly, but did lose and did leave. And did imagine a little girl with either gray or green eyes, and... Oh,